When most Americans think about the war in the Middle East, they're thinking about Tel Aviv, they're thinking about Tehran, they're thinking about the Gaza Strip. But while the world's been watching that front of the conflict, another story has been unfolding in the West Bank. And in a lot of cases, the people who are caught in the middle aren't just Palestinians, they're American citizens. I got to the West Bank shortly after the war broke out between Israel, the US, and Iran. And one thing that became really clear really quickly was that while the global attention was on this major regional war, violence between Israeli settlers and Palestinian citizens, many of whom are Americans, like I said, was skyrocketing across the West Bank, which is why I decided to pursue this story. And for context here, this wasn't a network assignment. I wasn't embedded with a major outlet. I didn't have the infrastructure that usually comes with foreign reporting. I came independently on my own because I wanted to spend time in these Palestinian villages in the West Bank with the people who are dealing with this violence firsthand. And I know for a lot of Americans, this conflict can feel distant or complicated or kind of hard to follow. But when you sit with these families face to face and hear their stories, many of these people whom are our neighbors, our doctors, our attorneys, our dentists in the US, the story becomes real. What they're dealing with becomes real. And the question of how this is happening to them without our government intervening becomes almost impossible not to ask. Now, before I get into what I saw in the West Bank, it's important to establish a few basics here. So for starters, the West Bank is a territory that Israel captured in the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. A lot of Palestinians see it kind of as the heart of a future independent state. Israel, however, though, they've maintained military control over the territory for decades, and it's very obvious when you're driving into the territory that that's the case. There's military checkpoints, there's cameras on almost every post, and then there's the fact that there's steel gates with padlocks that essentially lock the Palestinians in the West Bank into the villages that they live in. And even though for the most part the West Bank was carved out for Palestinians, over time Israeli civilians have started to build communities across the West Bank. So these are called settlements, and Israelis who live there are called settlers. Some become large towns like the Shiloh settlement, but others start out as these tiny little outposts is what they're called. They're kind of like just a tent that's pitched, or maybe a few structures on a hilltop, like a storage container or a few vans, before they start to expand and take over that land. Settlement growth is one of the most disputed issues in this whole conflict. A lot of the international community, including the International Court of Justice, considers these Israeli settlements illegal under international law, but Israel disputes this. They argue that their claims to the territory are lawful and historically grounded. Moral of the story, though, hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers now live in the West Bank. Okay, and then there's the question of who actually controls the land. So under the agreement signed in the 1990s, the West Bank was divided into three zones. There's areas A, B, and C. Area A is under Palestinian Authority control. Area B is jointly administered, and then Area C, which makes up more than 60% of the territory, remains under Israeli control. So those divisions were meant to be temporary, but decades later, they still, for the most part, shape daily life for the people there. They affect where Palestinians are able to build, who issues the permits, where Palestinians can travel, and where settlements are able to expand across the West Bank. So in the videos that follow, you'll hear from families who just lost their loved ones, from American Palestinians who feel abandoned by the system that's supposed to be protecting them, and from residents in these areas who describe land loss, movement restrictions, intimidation, and the spread of these Israeli settler outposts that are driving them out of their homes and causing violence throughout the area. This series is my attempt to make this conflict easier to understand but harder to ignore. So I'm Emma Withrow, and this is From the West Bank.